India's new foreign policy strategy, transformation, realignment, and the pursuit of power. Introduction: The strategic reorientation of Indian foreign policy. Foreign policy transformation is rarely accidental. It is usually triggered by structural disruptions in domestic or international systems. India's foreign policy transformation since the end of the Cold War reflects a strategic recalibration of national priorities shaped by economic liberalization, geopolitical realignments, and the decline of ideological rigidity. The intellectual foundations of India's early foreign policy were rooted in the Nehruvian framework of non-alignment and anti-colonial solidarity and moral internationalism. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the acceleration of globalization forced India to abandon the comfort of ideological continuity and adapt to a new international order structured by economic competition and strategic balancing. The transformation of India's foreign policy strategy was therefore been a mere policy adjustment but a pragmatic shift in strategic thinking. The transition from a state-led socialist economy to a market-oriented system reshaped India's external engagement priorities. Economic modernization became inseparable from domestic outreach, and foreign policy increasingly became an instrument of national development rather than ideological positioning. The tension between inherent diplomatic traditions and emerging geopolitical realities continue to shape India's strategic trajectory, indicating that foreign policy transformation is a continuous process rather than a completed project. The legacy of Nehruvian foreign policy and its strategic constraints. At independence, India adopted a distinctive foreign policy framework rooted in the intellectual and moral convictions of Jawaharlal Nehru. The principles of non-alignment, peaceful coexistence, and anti-imperial solidarity were not merely diplomatic tools, but the expressions of India's civilizational self-perception as a moral voice in international politics. The non-alignment provided India with diplomatic autonomy during the Cold War, allowing it to avoid formal alliances while maintaining strategic flexibility. However, Nehruvian framework gradually evolved into intellectual constraint, emphasizing on ideological consistency, limited India's ability to respond dramatically to shifting global power configurations. The belief that international relations could be governed by a moral principle underestimated the persistence of power politics in global affairs. Over time, the gap between normative aspirations and material capabilities widened, weakening India's strategic leverage. By the late 20th century, the global disruption of power had changed significantly, as well as the global distribution of power. The decline of bipolarity and the emergence of economic globalization exposed the limitations of ideological rigidity. India's adherence to socialist economic policies further constrained the ability to integrate global markets. As other Asian economies adopted export-oriented growth strategies, India's inward-looking economic model reduced its relative influence in global affairs. Structural changes in India's worldview, from ideology to pragmatism. The transformation of India's foreign policy since 1990s can be understood through a set of structural transitions in its worldview. The first transition was the shift from socialist economic framework to a market-oriented model. Economic liberalization in 1991 marked a turning point in India's engagement with the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union eliminated a key ideological anchor, forcing India to reconsider relationship between domestic economic policy and international diplomacy. Economic growth between central to national power and foreign policy began. Economic growth became central to national power and foreign policy began to prioritize trade, investment, and technological collaboration. The second transition involved a shift from political idealism to economic realism in diplomatic practice. India's diplomatic priorities increased focus on attracting foreign investment, expanding export markets, and integrating into global production networks. Economic diplomacy emerged as a core competence as well as an important component of foreign policy, reflecting the recognition that material prosperity was essential for sustaining geopolitical influence. The third transition was the gradual abandonment of the notion that India should primarily act as a leader of the developing world. During the Cold War, India positioned itself as the champion of Third World solidarity. However, the diversity of interests among developing countries and the rise of emerging economies revealed the limitations of collective ideological positioning. India began to prioritize national interest over rhetorical leadership of the global south. The recognition that economic growth could elevate India's status in the international hierarchy encouraged policymakers to pursue policies that enhance national competitiveness rather than symbolic solidarity. The fourth transition involved the erosion of anti-Western sentiment into Indian strategic thinking. During the Cold War, ideological polarization reinforced skepticism towards Western institutions and alliances. However, globalization and technological interdependence reduced the viability of anti-Western positioning. India increasingly recognized the strategic value of engaging Western economies and institutions to accelerate modernization. The fifth transition involved a movement from idealism to realism in the conduct of foreign policy, while normative values continued to influence public discourse. Policymakers increasingly prioritized national power, economic growth, and technological advancement. The recognition that moral rhetoric couldn't substitute for material capability encouraged a pragmatic approach to diplomacy, nuclear diplomacy, and the assertion of strategic autonomy. One of the most visible manifestations of India's strategic transformation was its nuclear policy. For decades, India advocated global nuclear disarmament while maintaining ambiguity regarding its own nuclear capabilities. The nuclear test conducted in 1998 marked a decisive shift towards strategic realism. India declared itself a nuclear weapon state, signaling its intention to secure deterrence capability in a region characterized by nuclear proliferation. The development of nuclear capability reflected a broad strategic calculation. India asserted that its economic growth and geopolitical importance would limit the duration and severity of international sanctions. This calculation proved accurate when the United States negotiated a civil nuclear agreement with India in 2005, effectively legitimizing India's nuclear status within the global non-proliferation framework. Nuclear diplomacy also demonstrated India's ability to balance strategic autonomy with engagement rather than isolating itself from international institutions. India pursued integration into the global nuclear regime on terms that preserved national sovereignty. This approach illustrates the broader pattern of Indian foreign policy that seeks to combine independence of action with participation in multilateral frameworks. Relations with major powers, strategic diversification. The end of the Cold War created opportunities for India to diversify its relations with major powers. During the bipolar era, India's strategic partnership with the Soviet Union limited its engagement with the United States and other Western powers. The dissolution of the Soviet Union removed this structural constraint, allowing India to pursue simultaneous engagement with multiple centers of power. Relations with the United States underwent a significant transformation. Economic reforms created opportunities for technological collaborations, trade expansion, as well as for defense cooperation. The Civil Nuclear Agreement symbolized a broader convergence of strategic interests, particularly in maintaining balance in Asia. At the same time, India preserved its outstanding relationship with Russia, recognizing the continued importance of defense cooperation and strategic alignment. Relations with Europe, Japan, China also expanded, reflecting India's strategy of maintaining multiple partnerships without entering binding alliances. This approach reflects the evolution of non-alignment into a more flexible concept of strategic autonomy. The improvement of relations with China represents one of the most significant developments in India's foreign policy. Despite historical tensions, economic interdependence, and diplomatic engagement have created a framework for managing competition. Similarly, India's strategic partnership with Japan reflects shared interest in regional stability and economic cooperation. Regional policy transformation, South Asia and the extended neighborhood. India's foreign policy transformation also involved recalibrating relations with neighboring states. Historically, India perceived itself as the dominant power in South Asia, often adopting unilateral approaches to regional security issues. However, economic globalization highlighted the importance of regional integration for sustaining growth. India adopted a more conciliatory approach towards similar neighbors, emphasizing economic cooperation and political dialogue. The recognition that regional stability contributes to national prosperity encouraged India to support multilateral initiatives such as the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. India also expanded its engagement with Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The Look East policy reflected the recognition that economic integration with dynamic Asian economies could accelerate domestic growth. Energy diplomacy became a key component of India's engagement with the Middle East and Central Asia, reflecting the strategic importance of securing stable resource supplies. Managing relations with Pakistan and China. The transformation of India's foreign policy included attempts to resolve long-standing conflicts with Pakistan and China. The nuclearization of South Asia altered the strategic environment, creating the risk associated with military confrontation. Diplomatic initiatives sought to establish mechanisms for conflict management and confidence building. Engagement with Pakistan involved attempts to normalize relationships despite persistent tension related to Kashmir and cross-border terrorism. Diplomatic initiatives demonstrated the recognition that prolonged conflict imposes economic and political costs. Similarly, while making negotiations with China aimed to resolve border disputes and expand economic cooperation. These diplomatic efforts create a broader shift towards pragmatic conflict management. Rather than seeking absolute victory, India increasingly prioritizes stability and incremental progress. Engagement with the Islamic world, strategic balancing. India's engagement with the Islamic world has evolved significantly since the end of the Cold War. Historically, India's policy towards Islamic countries was influenced by domestic political considerations and ideological commitments. However, economic interdependence and energy security have encouraged a more pragmatic approach. India has strengthened relations with key Islamic countries based on trade, investment, and security cooperation. Simultaneously, India expanded relationships with Israel, reflecting the diversification of diplomatic partnerships. This balancing approach demonstrates India's capacity to pursue multiple strategic relationships without exclusive alignment. The evolution of India's Middle East policy also reflects the importance of diaspora communities and remittance flows. Economic interdependence has reinforced the strategic value of maintaining stable relations with energy producing countries. Long term implications, power, responsibility, and strategic choices. India emerged as a major power, carries significant implications for its foreign policy. As material capabilities increase, expectations regarding India's contribution to global governance will also rise. India will face pressure to participate actively in addressing international crises, contributing to peacekeeping operations, and supporting multilateral institutions. The tension between strategic autonomy and international responsibility will remain a defining feature of India's foreign policy. As India's influence grows, it may be compelled to take positions on contentious international issues. The ability to balance international interests with global responsibility will shape India's long-term strategic credibility. Another challenge involves managing nationalism. Rising powers often experience domestic pressures for assertive foreign policies. Maintaining strategic discipline while accommodating domestic political dynamics will require careful calibration. India's foreign policy will also be influenced by the evolving balance of power among major states. Rivalries among the United States, China, Russia, and Europe may create strategic dilemmas. India's preference for flexibility suggests that it will avoid formal alliances while maintaining partnerships with multiple powers. Conclusion: continuity within transformation. India's new foreign policy strategy represents a synthesis of continuity and change. While the principle of strategic autonomy and civilizational identity remain influential, the methods of pursuing national interests have evolved significantly. Economic growth, technological advancement, and geopolitical balancing have become central to India's diplomatic practice. The transformation of India's foreign policy illustrates the interaction between domestic change and international structure. Economic liberalization enabled India to expand its diplomatic engagement, while geopolitical shifts created incentives for strategic adaptation. The resulting policy framework continues realism with selective idealism, allowing India to pursue national interests without abandoning normative commitments. India's future foreign policy trajectory will depend on its ability to sustain economic growth, manage domestic political diversity, and navigate great power competition. The evolution of India's strategic identity suggests that foreign policy will remain a dynamic instrument for securing national power, prosperity, and international influences.